Yeah, and I'm going to start the live stream now so that I don't screw it up later and hopefully get
Do
it.
you mute all the attendees?
Yeah, I have the power. It's set up as a meeting, so if people have been in before, they don't come in muted necessarily. But we don't generally have problems. So.
Don, what's the difference between chat and oh, wait a second. Okay. There was something else that usually appeared down there that sounded like the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there are different things. This is set up as a Zoom meeting. If you're in a Zoom webinar, there can be both chat and Q&A.
That's what that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
So Q&A, I think I think only the panelists can see, and we're not set up to have panelists, so that's not going to be an issue tonight. And the chat, everyone in the meeting can see. I think that's right. It might be the other way around, something like that. I've only done webinars a couple of times. I would guess at this point I've done more than 1,000 Zoom meetings. Probably many more than 1,000.
Yes. And we've zoomed out on Zoom meetings.
Yeah. Oh, it's finally, my Zoom density has finally decreased in the last few months, but boy, it's been high for a long time. So I'm going to start the my slideshow for coming events.
In spite of the Zoom fatigue, I do appreciate it if it's something where I'm going to have to drive a half an hour each way for a meeting. I just rather do a Zoom meeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree.
So I'm going to let the folks in from the waiting room. And I'll also make you co-host, Brenda.
Okay.
I don't think you actually need to do anything different as co-host, but I'll make you co-host so you have.
Well, if your computer crashes or something, I can.
Right. Good point. So welcome, folks. We aren't getting formally started for another 10 minutes or so, but welcome one and all. I think I've got somebody else to let in. So welcome to Science in the Virtual Pub, and we'll be talking about the amazing honeybee in about 10 minutes or so. We've got some coming attractions in the slideshow, and I'm going to pour myself a beer while we're virtual pub here. And tonight's beverage of choice is a Southern Tier New Haze.
Should be a mead.
Yeah, I thought about running out to see if I could find some mead, but I didn't get it done. Do you know, are you drinking a mead?
I'm not actually. But there is several local meaderies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm assuming that geez, what's the name of the really big fancy wine store? I'm assuming they carry it.
Probably not, because New York State is weird. So we have wine and liquor in those stores, and then we have beer and mead and things in other stores.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of stores can you buy mead in? Am I getting ahead of myself? Or
you should be able to just get it. But Bob, you can get mead in regular stores, right? Or is it only in liquor stores?
It's typically tap only at this point. It's
okay.
Not distributed because of volume.
Okay. So because did you hear that?
Yep, I did.
Okay.
Hi, Bob.
It's a lot easier to grow grains and other things to make distilled spirits and beer than get enough honey to produce huge quantities of mead.
Yeah, I can believe that. And Bryce, I apologize. I have a higher resolution picture of you. I thought I had made that switch. Still got 8 minutes to go. If other folks want to unmute themselves and chat, we can chat.
Don, will you need me to start the live stream?
I already started the live stream because I knew Ingrid wasn't going to be able to be here, so I was nervous and didn't want to screw it up doing too many things at once or forget to do it. So we are already live on YouTube. Cheers to people out there in YouTube land.
So I'm going to have to steer some students to your talk for extra credit.
Okay. Yeah, that's not a Science in the Pub, but a special event.
Okay.
And that's,
where can I find that information? Is it on the research?
This is the registration link for that. I should put a precursor on that. And I'll send you the newsletter. I can actually.
Okay.
That's got the announcement in it. People are filtering in. Hello, Brendan. And Rob and Brendan are both PRI colleagues. So we will get formally started about 5 after 7, and we've got coming attractions rolling while we let people filter in. Welcome one and all to Science in the Virtual Pub. We also have our next speaker in the audience. Bryce is going to be up in 2 weeks. Is that 2 weeks from tonight? Yes. Get a little, it's the second and fourth Thursday of the month. So I get a little confused.
Oh no.
Sometimes when we have 5 Thursdays
That's
a
the
month.
9th, yeah.
Yeah, but that is 2 weeks from tonight. And there's an announcement for our upcoming exhibit at the Museum of the Earth. Excuse me. So Science in the Virtual Pub is the second and fourth Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock, though we let people filter in for a few minutes and we'll formally get started at about 7:05. Tonight we've got Catching the Buzz with Brenda Young from Damon University talking about the amazing honeybee. A special event is me talking about my favorite lesson on climate change and why it's my favorite lesson on climate change. And I'll put a link to that in the chat in a little bit. I spoke over the things a little bit, so we'll emphasize those more when they come around the next time. So that is our forthcoming exhibit at the Museum of the Earth on the rocks of upstate New York and rocks and fossils. We are the second and fourth Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock. And I should really tweak that. We're going to go to having special events occasionally on either the second or fourth Thursday. So there again is tonight's speaker, Brenda Young, Catching the Buzz, the Amazing Honeybee. Then on March 7th, in a special event on a Tuesday, I will be talking about my favorite lesson on climate change. 2 weeks from tonight, we'll have Bryce Hand, who's in the audience tonight, talking about ravens and writing desks. 4 weeks from tonight, we'll have Nick Levine talking about, yes, we really can see that from space. I expect we'll also be talking a little bit about Chinese balloons in that session. And also coming up, but not yet fully fleshed out, is we'll have a session in April. One of the April sessions will be our Earth Day session with students from Cornell University talking about how we imagine ourselves in the future and how we addressed climate change so that the world lived on. And in May, we will have a session on what we need to do to modernize our electrical grid for the changes in the energy system. And some other, 2 other sessions will round out our year, and those are less defined at this point, but I expect by the time we're here together for Bryce in 2 weeks, I'll have the full schedule all fleshed out. We'll let the slides go around one more time, and I'll narrate them the next time they go around, and then I will hand it off to Brenda for talking about honeybees. And I'm Don Haas from the Paleontological Research Institution and the Museum of the Earth, your host for tonight's Science in the Virtual Pub. I'm getting a text from somebody that they're not being let in, so I'm not seeing somebody. I don't know what's going on there. So tonight we'll have Brenda Young. I'll fix that other problem in a minute. On March 7th, I'll be talking about my favorite lesson on climate change and why it's my favorite lesson on climate change. Then 2 weeks from tonight, we'll have Bryce Hand talking about ravens and writing desks. 4 weeks from tonight, we'll have Nick Levine talking about, yes, we really can see that from space. Other coming events will be an Earth Day event in April and a session on the changing electrical grid. And I am going to stop sharing now and hand it off to Brenda. So take it away, Brenda. I'm Brenda Young from Damon University, talking about the amazing honeybee.
Great, thanks, Don, for inviting me.
Thank you.
And I hope that there'll be something in this talk that is new for everyone. I'm going to start off with some basics just so that we're all on the same page as we talk about it. I am a beekeeper, also a biologist, and my research, which I'm not really going to be going into tonight, is looking at different, the way that both bumblebees and honeybees visit plants and choose specific species for their pollination activities. But today I'm going to talk specifically about the honeybee. I am constantly hearing from people, oh my gosh, I was attacked by a bee, etc. And I think everybody in this audience probably realizes that there are wasps, there are hornets, there are bumblebees, and the species I'm going to be talking about is in the bottom left here, the honeybee. Now, honeybees are not native to North America, whereas there are many native bumblebee species and all of these others. I'm not going to talk about the Asian hornet, but many people in Western New York, at least, will say, I think I've seen an Asian hornet, that huge hornet that they're talking about. And most likely you've seen this European hornet, which is much larger on the top right there. We have not yet had the Asian hornet in this area. So a little bit about bees. There are many different species of bees, and I'm specifically talking about the bees that are related to the genus Apis, which is the honeybee, and several of its close relatives. So if we look at a phylogenetic tree, the dwarf bees, giant bees, and cavity nesting bees all share a lineage. And there are a number of cavity nesting bees. The actual Apis mellifera, which are the honeybees, spun off of that. Now, a lot of molecular studies have investigated the origin. It's pretty well accepted that there was an origination in Asia, and then other subsequent subspeciations in Africa and then in Europe. So this bottom series of diagrams shows both the African, the European, and the Asian origins. So among all those cavity nesters, all belonging to this genus Apis, many of them are concentrated in Asia, as you see there, extending up into the Middle East, a little bit in Africa, but only the honeybee is widespread, essentially cosmopolitan at this point. And that's because humans transported it because we like honey. And it's a busy insect that does a lot of work for us and makes a valuable product. One of the things that's unique about honeybees is they do, in fact, live in a colony. And that colony survives the winter typically, unlike species like bumblebees, where it's only the queen that persists over the winter. So this colony has different castes, and they range in size and they range in function. So the queen bee, of course, is the important one. She's responsible for laying all the eggs to achieve that colony density. Workers are all females. I'll talk about that in a minute. And they are the busy bees. So when somebody says something about bees doing all the work, it's the females. The drone in the middle there with the very enlarged eyes here and a slightly chunkier abdomen, the males, I'm sorry, they're there for sex and they're there to steal the resources. They don't really contribute other than their genetic component to the success of the colony. As we look at the way that these different bees are produced, the queen extends her very large abdomen into the wax cells. We'll talk about wax formation in a few minutes. She lays a single egg in there. The egg develops into a larva. And when the larva is completely elongated, worker bees, again, those females, come along and they cap off the top of that cell, the cell being that part of the comb specific for that particular larva. They cap it with wax. It continues its development, it pupates, and then it emerges as an adult. The actual number of days depends on the caste that's developing, but it goes through all of these stages regardless. So as we look at the honeybee cycle, you might suspect that with the queen being the largest of the three, that it would take longer for her to develop. That is not the case. The queen actually develops in fewer days because she's the beneficiary of a very rich proteinaceous diet called royal jelly. So she can develop very quickly. Worker bees are next in line, and then the drones take much longer for development. And this particular scheme here that has different days is fairly uniform. When we talk about lots of insects, we talk about degree day development, which is that insects develop at different rates depending on the temperatures to which they're exposed to. In the case of honeybees, because they're living in a colony and they're maintaining a relatively constant temperature, it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about honeybees here in New York or we're talking about them in the Southwest. The number of days for each of these stages is relatively uniform. One of the things I find most interesting about honeybees is what we call haplodiploid sex determination. This is true in a number of insect species. I worked previously with scale insects, and that happens in those organisms as well. But in this case, we're talking about a colonial species, and the queen has two sets of chromosomes, which means she's diploid. She has chromosomes from her father and her mother. The drones, the males, are haploid. They only have one set of chromosomes, which they acquired from their mother. So in this case, the queen is going to mate with the male drone. They actually mate with multiple drones, as I'll tell you about in a few minutes. But the female then, the queen, stores the sperm, and she can choose when she lays eggs to either allow those eggs to be fertilized, in which case they go on to be her daughters and diploid, sharing a set of chromosomes with their mother and their father, or she can choose to lay unfertilized eggs, in which case they develop as haploid male drones, which means they only have the one set of chromosomes. It introduces an interesting set of relatedness into the hive because, of course, the drones share their complete chromosome complement with their mother. Workers are essentially sisters, and they share, on average, 75% of their genes. So in some cases, it may be 100% with a sister, or it may be 50%. So on average, it's 75%. And this, in part, contributes to some of the theories about eusociality, how these colonies developed, where the worker females sacrifice their opportunity to reproduce and are completely essentially servants to maintain the hive and ensure that the queen survives and is able to lay her eggs. Interesting anatomy on the honeybee, like many insects, compound eye, ocelli that determine light intensity. But in order to perform the functions that they have, they also have a number of other modifications. They go out, the foragers go out and leave the hive. They collect pollen from flowers, which is very protein rich. And the pollen grains are very, very sticky. So they cluster those and attach them to a hind limb where there are various hairs that can allow those pollen grains to stick together and form what is called a pollen basket. And it can literally fall off in mass, containing thousands of pollen grains. Of course, there's a stinger at the end. We'll talk about that later. But they also have the capacity to produce wax, which is important for developing the hive that they live in. And so there are abdominal wax glands, which I'll show you in another slide. Workers produce a food that is fed to larvae for the first couple days and the queen through her development, called royal jelly. And that's produced by these hypopharyngeal glands, so just in the neck region there of the honeybee. When they go off and forage, they're able, with that proboscis mouth part here, to suck up the liquidy nectar and then store that in a honey stomach or a crop that's further down in the body. And then when they return to the hive, they're able to regurgitate that and share that with the other bees. Here's a bee with the abdomen showing, and you see 4 pairs of wax glands. The younger bees are the ones that produce that wax and help to form this comb that you see on the right there. As the bees mature and become foragers, those wax glands actually atrophy and they're no longer able to manufacture that. This is a schematic showing a piece of hive. And on a given, if it's a beekeeper with a fixed frame, it's usually a plastic or wooden frame where the beekeeper has put in some wax and then the bees add to that. Or even a natural hive that bees form in a cavity of a tree, et cetera, there's going to be a certain configuration. So there are going to be certain wax cells that are devoted to storing the honey. And then there are going to be some cells that are devoted to storing pollen, which is protein rich, is used as a food source as well. Some of the cells are going to be devoted to raising the brood. And those may be in various stages, the eggs that the queen has just laid, the larvae that are developing. And then as the larvae get further along, they get capped, and then they're developing into pupae. There also are special cells that are slightly larger that are used to produce the males. So most of the capped larvae over here are going to be worker females. These are going to be the males for the drone cells. And then the hive also has to ensure that if something were to happen to their current queen, that they would be able to produce another queen in the future. So you will see queen cells that are manufactured, and then eggs will be put into that queen cell and fed a special diet that will allow them to mature. So if we look at an actual photo here, what look like little peanuts here are actually those queen cells. So they're very elongated. Most of these brownish hued cells are actually worker cells. They have a relatively flat top. There's some open ones here where there may be an egg at the bottom, which we can't necessarily see. Here you see some larvae. And then on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see some dimpled types of cells where the top is coming out. Literally, those are the drone cells. So you can differentiate them just by looking at a frame because the drone cells have that different configuration. That can be important for beekeepers because sometimes we want to eliminate drones because they're a drain on the hives, but also because they can harbor a higher incidence of some parasites. Here's various photos. So a fairly uniform laying of brood. All of these worker bees here are just being hygienic, cleaning things, potentially feeding any hive cells that have not been capped. On the right-hand side here, you see a hive that's been formed in the wild. So while beekeepers may do it just for convenience on flat frames, you can also have this kind of configuration. The bottom left there, what we can see at the very top, which has a whiter appearance, are cells filled with honey that have been covered with wax. So when bees produce the honey and they dry it down to about 17%, they put a waxy cap over there to preserve it. And then there's a little bit of pollen cells in there, and then the brood is centrally located in the middle of that frame. Bees are amazing in terms of the different things that they make. We'll talk about honey, we'll talk about the royal jelly, but they also make something called propolis, which is essentially bee superglue. So bees sometimes are out there visiting various trees, often conifers. They collect some of the balsam. From that, they combine it with some pollen and some wax, and they make this material known as propolis. And it will seal up any gaps in a hive to prevent some airflow or moisture from getting in. Truly amazing and very sticky and messy to work with. The queens that we've saw pictures of before, when they develop in a hive, so if a hive rears a queen, that queen is going to be an unmated or virgin queen. So in order for her to get to the point where she can lay eggs, she's going to have to leave her colony, go out, find males, mate, and then hopefully successfully return to that same hive to then begin her reproductive phase in that hive. And there are a lot of ifs in all of that because she could be picked off by a bird. She could fail to navigate back to that hive. She could fail to get mated. So lots and lots of ifs. You might have thought before when I was talking about the sex determination and talking about males and females, well, there's a lot of inbreeding, there's a lot of incest, but the reality is from studies of bees and looking at the sperm that they contain, et cetera, they are frequently mating with as many as 20 different males on that mating flight. I think the record that I heard was 40 different males. So the sperm that female queen has stored can be that mix of anywhere typically between 6 and 20 different males. So that does contribute to some genetic diversity in that hive. And we call that polyandry, where it's one female mating with multiple males. The other neat thing is there are drones coming from many different hives, and how is it that a female is going to find that drone? Those drones tend to congregate with one another in a cluster that you see here off on the right, and they tend to use the same areas for congregations on an annual basis. So they seem to know where to go routinely, and hopefully the queen is drawn to them by odor, etc. The secret for communication, we're going to talk about some movements by the bees, but also there are a number of other signals that can be given off chemically by the queen herself. Some of those are stimulants or releasers, some of them are inhibitors. So on this diagram on the right-hand side, you'll see that she can encourage lots of different behaviors. She can encourage the bees, the worker bees, to come around and gather around her. There's a phenomenon known as swarming, where when the hive gets to a certain size, the bees will split off, and the queen and some of those workers will leave to go find and form another hive. They will leave behind their queen cells so that the remaining workers can rear a new queen. But that swarm clustering can be signaled by the queen when she detects that kind of density. On the right-hand side, very importantly, why is she the only one that lays eggs? Well, she suppresses the ovaries from developing in her daughters, in her female offspring. And if the queen is killed in some way and there is not a new queen that is produced, it is possible for those workers to start to lay eggs. However, they will only, because they have not mated, only lay haploid eggs. So they will only lay drone eggs. And that's not really going to be helpful to the hive to survive. Some of her releaser effects also stimulate certain behaviors on the part of those workers. So here's a slide with a laying worker. I actually encountered this in one of my hives last year. You see in each of these cells, you see lots of what look like little rice grains. Those are actually multiple eggs. Typically, a queen will only lay one egg in each of those cells. And then that egg has the capacity, depending on whether it's fertilized or not, to develop into a male or a female. In this case, with the laying worker, she can only produce drones. So you see the drones there on the left. Swarming is an interesting phenomenon. Here you see a cluster of bees around a branch. They are swarming. You can see them top right there, flying off. And that is a phenomenon which happens routinely. It is, in fact, important for the species to be able to spread that way and disperse. From the standpoint of a beekeeper, though, they see their resources potentially disappearing. But it is important for the long term. If you find a swarm, maybe on your property, and it's maybe on the eaves of your house and you don't really want it there, or in your attic, there are beekeeper networks that will come and remove a swarm, because then they can start their own colony from that. The right-hand side here, you see lots of those peanut-shaped queen cells. Typically an indication that they are considering swarming is a proliferation of those queen cells, because they're trying to make sure that they have the ability for that hive to sustain itself with a future queen. So we've all heard the expression, busy as a bee. Remember, it's those females that are doing all that hard work. There are different tasks that bees do, and those tasks are age dependent. So when a worker bee first hatches out and says, wow, here I am in this colony, she's got cleaning duty. So she's going to be cleaning up debris, tossing that, and serving kind of as a nurse bee as well. Then she's going to move on to feeding the larvae. And you can see someone tending the larvae here, going to be regurgitating food to them. Initially, it's going to be something called royal jelly, and then later it's going to be other food items. She may be feeding her nest mates, obviously ensuring that the queen has the resources she needs. There'll be bees returning to the hive, bringing pollen and nectar, and they will, these worker bees in the hive will take that pollen and pack it into cells. You see the brightly colored orange yellow cells here on the right-hand side. Those contain pollen, and those are also incorporated into food resources for the bees. And then when they're finally a little bit more mature, they're going to be foraging bees. So the end of their lifetime is typically out foraging, getting to see the bigger world, potentially being picked off by birds, and then bringing their whatever they take in the wild back to the hive to help sustain it. Now, that differentiation between the queen bee, who's going to have a life of reproduction, and the nurse bee and foragers is maintained by different hormone levels. So JH is a juvenile hormone. It's found in all insects, and depending on its level or titer, it controls the level of development of those organisms. So queens maintain a high juvenile hormone titer. Nurse bees have a relatively low titer, and they're in the hive. As they increase in that juvenile hormone, they differentiate into that forager. It doesn't change their anatomy other than their wax glands might atrophy, but then they're able to go off and do their bidding. One of the safeguards, though, you might say, well, what happens if so many bees transition to foragers, or the foragers all die off because of pesticide, and then there's nobody out there working? Every time a forager comes back, they are communicating with the remaining bees in the hive. And they have a fatty acid secretion, which can act as an inhibitor. So the nurse bees and the cleaners and all of those kind of retain that status until they're a little bit older. If they're failing to get that inhibitor, then they will transition earlier to that forager stage. So what do they eat? What do they make? They will go out and collect the pollen-rich, protein-rich pollen that you see there. Usually they are not collecting pollen and nectar on the same journey. Nectar is that very carbohydrate-rich, sugary solution that flowers produce. It also contains some amino acids, but it's much less protein-rich than pollen. And they will take that up with their mouth part, as I mentioned. Royal jelly, it's kind of a milky substance. It's produced by the hypopharyngeal glands of bees. And then the other thing that they will do is make something called bee bread, which they're going to use pollen, they're going to use some saliva, and also some nectar to make that. So the duties then, we've got foraging bees out on flowers. You see that orange there? That's an orange pollen. I'll see bees sometimes with white pollen baskets because they've been feeding on a flower that has white pollen. And they return. Some of that pollen can be packed as pollen that can then be used to make bee bread, which is fed to a number of members. And then the nectar can be transformed into honey. So essentially that sugary solution, bees will dehydrate it and it becomes more concentrated in those wax cells. They will cap it, and that is then stored honey that the hive can use as a reserve throughout the winter months. Of course, we as humans often steal that honey for our own uses, and they can also use the honey throughout the season as a food source. Here you see a bee on the right there with the pollen basket. My actual research, I tend to look at the different species of plants that these bees are visiting. And since I cannot move as quickly as a bee and see all of the flowers that a particular bee visits, I can catch a bee, remove a pollen basket, which again is a big sticky mass of lots and lots of pollen grains, and then using stained pollen grains, I can examine them microscopically and know what specific flowers they've been visiting. So here on the left is just a representation of different pollen grains that you could use as an identification. You can create a library of these as a reference. Again, with amazement, bees do a lot of communication. It's not just chemical communication, but those foragers come back and say, hey, I found a really, really good spot. You guys should check it out. Don't waste your time going over there. There is a really good spot that's at a certain distance. So using a communication that is relative to the position of the sun, they do figure eights through the hive, and the angle of their abdomen relative to the sun helps to orient those bees to the cardinal direction that the subsequent foragers should use when they go out to locate those great food sources. They also can, the duration of their dance gives an indication of just how far from the hive the resources really are. So a lot of communication in that. Carl von Frisch shared a Nobel Prize years and years ago over his determination of this communication language. So the diet. what do we feed? Well, early on, everybody gets a little dose of that protein-rich, milky substance, the royal jelly. But sorry, if you're going to be a worker, you're only going to get a little taste of that for a couple days. If you're going to be a queen, though, you're going to get lots of that royal jelly. And that's what speeds up that development of the queen. So she has a much shorter development phase than do the workers. And the nurse bees and workers in the hive really attend to those future queens. You'll also notice that the anatomy here, the queen is a little bit different. She does have, quote, a stinger. It is a smooth stinger, unlike the worker bees that have a barbed stinger. She has the ability to store the sperm as well, and her ovaries are then going to be active for reproduction. In recent years, they've explored exactly how the development is controlled by the diet. And we now have a better understanding of not only our RNA and DNA, but the fact that there are microRNAs that control gene expression, and that certain plants are very rich in these microRNA compounds, whereas certain plants are not as rich in it. So royal jelly tends not to have a lot of those gene controlling components in it, but it's extremely rich in nutrition and allows for that faster development. The bee bread, which is what these workers are fed after they get their initial dose of royal jelly, is a mix of protein and pollen and other substances, and has a much richer component of those gene expressing RNA sequences. So what lots of us are interested in, of course, is honey. And it takes lots of bees, as I'll show you in a few minutes, to produce the amount of honey that we might want. So those busy bees leave the hive, they go off, they locate those flowers. Maybe they've tuned into the dance of one of their sisters, so they know where to go and save themselves some time and energy. They go out, they suck up that nectar, store it in that honey crop, that stomach. They come back, and then they share it with a number of the bees remaining in the hive. And those bees then, it's going to be distributed into some of those wax cells, and the bees are busy fanning those open cells at this point with their wings so that they can dehydrate remove the water from the honey down to 17%. So nectar has more water certainly than honey does. Once it's dehydrated to that level and it's capped, honey will not rot, it will not mold, it will not even ferment when it's sealed like that. So it is an amazing substance. It will last for potentially hundreds or thousands of years. Often the color of honey is an indication of the flowers, the nectars that the particular bees fed on. If it's raw honey and it's not filtered extensively, there will be some pollen and other materials in there, but it's just one of the substances that bees produce. I mentioned the propolis before. There's the bee bread, there's the royal jelly, there's bee pollen, and of course the stinger produces bee venom. And many of these have beneficial properties. All of these are antibacterial. So honey, you can spread it on a wound. In fact, in ancient days, a lot of wounds were treated by either sugar now or with honey, and it would allow the wounds to heal because it prevented various bacteria from growing on those wounds. In terms of the work, well, busy bees. To produce a single pound of honey, so imagine a big jar of honey, a single bee would have to visit 2 million flowers. And that probably is an underestimate. And obviously she's working as part of a colony. Bees on average, if they're lucky, they'll live 40 days. So they're visiting 1,000 flowers and producing a teaspoon of honey over that particular time. So that's a lot of activity. That's not the only thing, of course, that they need to make, because they need to make wax. they need to make propolis, and it actually takes 6 times the resources just to be able to make the wax from the hive. So bees do need to go out and actually get water as well. And a lot of people that keep bees kind of forget that there needs to be a water resource for them as well. I mentioned before, degree day development is really important to maintain the temperature of the hive. On the left, there is an infrared camera, and it's a stacked series of boxes. Inside those boxes are frames of bees, and the bees are clustered. That bright yellow area is where all the bees are clustered in the winter to try to keep warm. So they're trying to maintain about 95 degrees in that particular hive. In summer, of course, the hive can get very hot. So you see on the right-hand side here, the bees are all out on the front of the hive. They're not thinking of swarming in this case, but they're out there trying to reduce the number of bees on the inside. They're heating everything up. They might be fanning the hive. As you see the center bee here, the wings are moving very rapidly. Just as we might try to fan ourselves, they're trying to cool the hive as well. You don't want it to get too hot either. We're all familiar with the idea that bees, like other stinging insects, have the capability of defending themselves. So here on the left, you see a worker with a barbed stinger injecting it. Yes, stings hurt, but they don't want to sting. Unlike hornets and wasps that can repeatedly sting, if a honeybee stings, typically her stinger is yanked off, her abdomen is pulled off, she's going to die. So she's doing that as a means of defending herself, defending the hive. If you're disturbing a hive, they will release a chemical that is, or a series of chemicals that are considered to be an alarm pheromone. And it's like, rally the troops, guys. Something is invading. It's a bear attacking our hive, or it's a terrible human beekeeper that's coming into the hive. And the bees get very, very agitated. Now, the actual odor, if you happen to be standing there and they release it, smells very much like banana, which is why you never, ever walk by a beehive and you eat a banana, because they will think that that is an alarm pheromone and they will run up. My husband has made that mistake of eating a banana, walking by some of my hives, only to be stung in the ear by some very aggressive bees. So very similar chemical composition to bananas. If you know that smell, you know what an alarm pheromone smells like. Many of you may have heard that bees and pollinators in general are declining. The term colony collapse disorder has been ascribed to it. And this kind of little busy diagram here is just all the, in some cases ludicrous, but in some cases reasonable speculations on why that might be the case, why these colonies are suffering loss. Electromagnetic radiation was proposed. Maybe cell towers are doing it because it's disorienting the bees. Not too many people put stock in that anymore, but we know that we've altered our environment. We know that there are a number of stressors out there, and those stressors include parasites. They include the various chemicals that we put on our agricultural fields, the fact that we have monocultures on many of our agricultural fields. So honeybees don't need corn or soybeans in order to collect their nectar and everything that they might visit. So they want to see a mix of different wildflowers. And we tend to plant monocultures on a multi-acre basis. So their nutrition gets compromised. Some speculation there might be some genetic issues. Certainly weather is varied as well. And so that all of that's going to impact the colony health, the ability of the individuals to lay eggs, and then for successful rearing in all of this. So I'm going to talk about some of the parasites and diseases that are affecting them. This chronic colony collapse was really identified in about 2006, 2007. And what you see in this graph is the number of honeybee colonies. These are commercial colonies that were being monitored, and their numbers have been declining. So people got very alarmed. The commercial producers came back. Their hives were empty. What happened to the bees? Did aliens take them? You know, there was a lot of speculation about that. First finger was pointed at a species of parasitic mite that was introduced into the United States in the late 80s. It had been present elsewhere. And we now know that there are many factors that are responsible for it. Here in New York State, there is the Bee Wellness group that collects data, sends out surveys to beekeepers, and they're now monitoring both summer loss and winter loss. And we see annual losses that are variable, of course, because we have some winters that are colder or warmer than others, et cetera. But you can see a high degree of variability from year to year and even within a given year. Whoops, I skipped the nasty one here. So the most famous parasite that was introduced in the 80s that's often blamed for a lot of this decline is the varroa mite. You see the honeybee on the left-hand side, you see several mites on her back there. And here's a magnified one in the middle. These tend to get to the hive by hitching a ride on a worker or forager that's out there. It's not thought that they necessarily feed directly on that bee immediately, but when they get to the hive, they try to get into some of the larval cells and then reproduce and increase the numbers of the mites. And then they will attach themselves to an emerging new adult honeybee when that undergoes development. They have a preference for the drone cells, which is one reason why sometimes beekeepers will try to eliminate some of those drone cells just to keep the mite numbers down. And to put this into perspective, in the top right there, you can see this scale of a mite on one of those developing larvae. Besides feeding on the fat bodies of the honeybee, some of the stored materials, they also transmit a virus. So this bee here has, you can see wings that are very distorted. That is actually caused by a virus that is transmitted by this particular species of mite. We have a new mite on the spectrum, not present yet in the United States, but a lot of people are getting concerned about this particular mite that is native to Asia. And it actually has faster reproduction, slightly different body shape, and it feeds on the hemolymph, or essentially the blood of the bee. There are other pests that the bees have to contest with. Here you see a number of hive beetles. It's actually the larvae that cause a little bit more problem, but they'll eat the wax, they'll eat some of the honey, and sometimes the larvae. If it's a healthy beehive, they can usually survive with that. It's only when their numbers come down in number. When beehives start to dwindle in numbers, they become very susceptible to a wax moth. And here's a caterpillar, the larva of the wax moth. They form this webby material. They poop in there, create a lot of debris, and really make a mess of a hive. So you have to scrape all of that out. The bees usually abandon it at that point, and it's a lost entity. There are bacterial diseases as well. One of the worst ones is called American foul brood. You'll see this ropey material with an infected larval cell. It's called foul brood. It does smell, and it is contagious. It's a type of bacillus that spreads. And so beekeepers literally have to burn all their equipment if they have this contamination. This is the one, if you've been listening on the news and they've said, wow, there's a new vaccine for bees. And you might be thinking somebody's going to go out and inoculate all these bees with a little needle. It is a compound that will be incorporated in royal jelly, fed in the hive, taken in by the queen, and then the queen will be inoculating any of the eggs that she lays by the consumption of that particular vaccine. So it's not yet implemented, but it will be in the future. One of the other main culprits for this colony collapse disorder is the use of pesticides. And we have had, of course, changes over the years of the different types of pesticides that we use. There's a class of pesticide that really became prevalent in the 80s. It was developed. Bayer Chemical did a lot of the development for this. And then you could see it's really become 2004 onward, numbers have really, really increased. So this class is called neonicotinoids. The chemical structure is a lot like nicotine, which can harm insects as well. That's one of the reasons why the tobacco plant produces it. But we now use it in a lot of different ways. And the photo there on the left-hand side, you can see corn kernels, and the right-hand side, you see pink corn kernels. Those are corn kernels that have been coated with a neonicotinoid. So it keeps weevils and other organisms from deteriorating those seeds. The coated seeds get planted in the field by farmers, and that coating will, of course, come off, but that chemical does either get in the soil, or it can actually be a dust that gets distributed. So while I'm on this slide, I just want to point out the exponential use of this class of compounds. And remember, our chronic colony collapse was first identified around 2006, 2007. We've just seen this onward surge in this particular class of compounds. So the combination of these insecticides coupled with the various parasites really might have a synergistic effect, causing the declines in the hives. And, it's not isolated just to honeybees. These really contaminate the entire ecosystem. So we have to question how we use our pesticides, whether we're using them judiciously, and the kind of impact that we're introducing. So birds, of course, feed on seeds. They can succumb when the dust and the material ends up in aquatic environments. It can affect aquatic invertebrates and can impact soil invertebrates. It gets incorporated from the seed itself into the remainder of the plant. So when bees visit those plants, of course, they're picking it up in the pollen, etc., and it can impact the entire food web. So we need to be mindful of those dramatic impacts. It's said with the decline of pollinators, what's going to happen? Are we going to have anything to eat? Well, the good news is there are lots of native pollinators that do the busy work for lots of plants. But there are a few species that are heavily reliant on honeybees. Almonds, we have our major almond production in California, and the commercial beekeepers are shipping their hives out there. Also a stressor to those hives. But those almonds have to be pollinated by honeybees. A lot of our blueberries, similarly, are pollinated by honeybees. So if, in fact, our honeybees were to disappear, besides not having honey, we would suddenly find ourselves having to do the bees' work. And that might mean going out and dusting. Already there are apple producers that are spreading pollen by spraying it across their orchards. Here in the middle, you see somebody that's charged with going up and dusting various blossoms in order to spread that pollen, or like the squash on the left-hand side there as well. So hopefully it doesn't come to that. Well, we would definitely have a lot of jobs, but many people would not particularly appreciate that kind of task. So I'll encourage anybody that has a lawn to consider altering it from a monoculture of grass, which doesn't help any pollinators, to something that incorporates more flowers and have a flowering lawn. We're trying to promote people to allow clover, et cetera, to grow in their lawn, because at least it is a resource for a lot of the wildflowers. And I'll take any questions that anybody might have. I try to keep things fairly simple, but there is a lot of extensive research behind what I'm talking about.
That was great, Brenda. Thank you. Questions? You can either raise your hand on your by clicking the reactions button on your Zoom, or you can just raise your hand in your picture, and hopefully I'll see that.
Or if there's no questions, then you should go off and get some mead and drink that. and
That's
thank the bees.
That's right. And I will note that PRI, the Museum of the Earth, had a temporary exhibit on bees in 2020, which of course people had a hard time getting to because it was 2020. But we have a virtual version of that exhibit, which let me put in the what that forwards to when you click on that, so you can have an actual working link there. There's a virtual exhibit there that you can explore around on. Questions?
I have a question. Brenda, I was fascinated by the idea that you can figure out the different plants that bees have been going to by looking at the pollen, which is logical. And I wondered if there's like, basically you can track the diversity of an environment by what the bee is going to, or if the bees are looking at a fairly small fraction of things that they're willing to go to. So the number of species that they are likely to visit isn't necessarily indicative of the environment that they're in.
That's a great question, and it's it's complex. First of all, bees can fly up to 3 miles, probably a little further even. So you're not exactly sure how small that environment is that you're trying to look at. Bees will demonstrate a preference for things. So if you're following a particular bee and they're visiting purple flowers, they might for that day visit the same species of purple flower or multiple purple flowers. Only if they kind of run out of those flowers that have resources will they necessarily switch to another. But within the same hive, there might be a sister that is visiting white flowers on that day or yellow. So in part, it is what is available, what is blooming, whether they're collecting pollen, whether they're collecting nectar, and there seems to be individual preferences. It may be that they stumble upon a given flower of a species first out of the hive, and then they stay faithful to that. Now, you can imagine if there are lots and lots of bees out foraging, that particular flowers will have already been visited. And so it would be a waste of their time to visit that same flower. Oh, it's empty or whatever. Flowers will replenish the nectar, but it will take time to do so. And they tend to leave a little bit of fatty acid on those flowers. So it's like you kind of do a quick flyby. Oh no, somebody's been here and that kind of thing. And it dissipates over about the same amount of time that it takes the flower to replenish the resource. So, it's a very complex story associated with that. It's also possible that they're selecting certain flowers because those pollens have a particular amino acid composition, which hasn't been quite as well researched yet. But, there are so many unanswered questions out there. My particular interest, and the reason I'm more focusing on the pollen than the nectar, is the plants. This is a quote, a mutualism, a beneficial relationship between the plant and the insect. And if a bee goes out and visits a rose flower and takes that pollen from that rose flower and dumps it on a daisy, it's not going to help the rose. It's not going to help the daisy either. So I'm interested in, how faithful is a given bee, because from the plant standpoint, they have to be carrying pollen of a particular species to another plant species. So I look at it with that kind of lens when I'm monitoring them.
Maybe that helps explain personal preference if
Yeah.
they, when they go to a particular kind of plant. Fascinating.
Availability and everything else too.
Other questions? I've got one or two if no one else does. There's one in the chat from Patrick. We often hear about the beneficial qualities of local honey, especially with regard to treating allergies. Can you comment on this claim? If this
I
claim
can anecdotally, and one of the key things with local honey, if it's raw honey, which means it hasn't been pasteurized, it hasn't been heated to higher temperature, and it hasn't been filtered extensively, it is going to contain some of the pollen from those species. So the idea is that if you have allergies to various pollen species, that you could be desensitized by exposure through honey that contains pollen from that area. I don't know myself, I don't have those allergies, but I do sell some of my raw honey to dog owners that show their dogs and do all those sorts of things. Their dogs have skin allergies that vets have said is related to pollen, et cetera. And some of those people have come back to me and repeatedly purchased because they say it has made a big difference for their dogs. Dogs will happily lap up honey. I can tell you mine will do that too. But I don't actually consume a lot of honey. My husband goes through huge amounts of honey, and I don't think his allergies have been as bad as they were in the past.
So why that inspired another question for me is, why do they pasteurize honey if it doesn't go bad?
Well, again, it doesn't really matter if it's pure honey, but sometimes some of the honey that is sold in stores is not 100% pure honey.
Mhm.
And there's also the misconception that it might go bad. So if they pasteurize it, then they have that assurance that there's not something in there that might cause it to ferment, et cetera. But I have, fermented. The one problem with honey that hasn't been processed in a particular way is that it will crystallize. But that's not an issue. Just warm it gently and it will, of course, go back into solution, things like that.
Yeah.
I saw that Hal had a question there about robbing. Yes. So if you have multiple hives, everybody likes to have somebody else do their work, right? So if a hive, and I didn't mention that one of the jobs that those bees do is serve as a guard bee. So they're the ones that are waiting if a bear or a human comes to their hive, they're out there ready to release that alarm pheromone and sting. And theoretically, those guard bees only have that particular task for a couple days, but I can tell you they have a memory. So I will disturb a hive in a given day, be chased to the point where I go and get my car. The next day I come and there's a bee waiting near my car. They will follow me 150, 200, 250 yards from a hive and finally give up the chase. But they seem to remember me the next day. So they're active defenders. They also get challenged by yellow jackets. Yellow jackets are notorious in the fall for sneaking into honeybee hives to steal some of that honey. If there's a high enough density in the hive, they will be successful in repelling them. I've seen them sting and chase off yellow jackets. But if a hive gets small, it's going to be robbed by other honeybee colonies. It can be robbed by anything. Mice get in there. One of the things you have to do for hives that you maintain is put mouse guards on. Mice probably are not going up into trees, into the cavities, but there are a lot of things, of course, that can get in there and steal that honey.
Other questions?
I have a question, and that is, are there particular plants that it would be good to plant in your garden for honeybees?
Absolutely. And you can go online and look for either a pollination garden or a bee garden, and they'll have a lot of recommendations. In an ideal sense, if you had the time to plan out a garden, you'd want to have things that were blooming at different times so that the bees had a resource. Early in the spring, the bees are normally going to things like willow. They're going to a lot of trees. Willow, they'll go to maple, then they'll go to dandelions and a lot of the very small spring wildflowers. And then they're going to go to the more typical perennials that many of us might plant in the summer months. So lavender is a great one, coneflowers, milkweed, butterfly bush, all of those readily attract the bees. And of course, they're pretty for us in terms of the blooms.
Other questions? So a question from, go ahead, Judy. Oops, except you got muted. You're muted, Judy. Let's see if I can unmute you. Or are you talking amongst yourselves? Well, I'm not sure if there's a question there or not. There we go. Do you have another question, Judy?
No, it's just a comment. I bought a quart of honey from a friend who's a beekeeper, and to my astonishment, it has never crystallized.
You know,
So-
that's a function of the flowers that they visited.
Hmm.
So goldenrod, which is frequently visited, of course, it's one of our few native wildflowers that's a good bee plant in New York. It notoriously will crystallize, but there are other things like buckwheat, which some people will use buckwheat as a cover crop in agricultural settings. That does not crystallize. So it's a function of, you know, the composition of that nectar. And some crystallize more readily than others.
Thank you.
So a question I have is, did you become a beekeeper first or a researcher of bees first?
Oh, no, researcher, definitely. So my fascination with bees has always been their behavior. When I was a graduate student, I was a teaching assistant for an animal behavior class, and I had to maintain the hive and all of that. So just, you know, fascinated by that, and thought at some point in my future, I want to have, my own hive. But no, I've been out collecting pollen from wild bees for years. And it was only when we bought a farm and I had the land and I had a little bit of time that I had the opportunity. We have a couple of beekeepers here in Western New York that mentor people. So I did a mentorship program and established my own hives, and have been growing the number of hives I have each year and trying to beat my survival rate from the previous year. So it was definitely secondary to my research.
So how many hives do you have now?
Currently, I have 10. I checked them a couple of weeks ago when it was warmer, and they're making it. But the most challenging time for them is the early spring with the fluctuating temperatures, because their metabolism, they're going to crank up a little bit, and they're going to start going through that honey reserve or whatever food reserve they might have. You will see honeybees flying anytime it's about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes a little bit lower than that. And they might just be going out to literally have a poop flight, because you can imagine if you had to hold it all winter, that could be really tough. So they will do those hygienic flights, literally go out, do their business, come back. Because right now, of course, there's very little that's available for them for foraging.
And there's another question in the chat from Ecuador. So you said that the flowers that have already been visited have a mark. What implication would that have at the level of epidemiology? Because one of the hypotheses is that the bees could be contaminated by parasites or pathogens when they visit the flowers.
So it's a very short duration mark. Usually that fatty acid, I actually know of the work more from bumblebees, but when they visit and land on the flower, some of it is essentially from their feet. It probably dissipates in an hour or two, long enough for the flower to replenish the nectar. I don't know that it would necessarily impact the transfer of any disease or anything, because they're not really communicating that there might be a parasite or a bacterium or anything associated with that particular flower. But there are many interesting questions that we could kind of explore as we look at how those bees are exposed to various bacteria in the wild, how they might be exposed to a number of these viruses.
And there's another question in the chat. Have you heard anything about the Chinese scholar trees poisoning bees?
No, I'll have to look that up. What can you tell me?
And if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead.
I've read one or two obscure accounts that it does happen, and I've seen bumblebees getting stoned on their flowers.
Oh, stone. I misheard you. I'm sorry. Yeah, it might well happen. There's a great video of African animals around marula trees that with fermented compounds essentially get drunk. So if you had fermented nectar of any kind, it's a possibility that they could.
No,
it's
not the fermenting. It's something in the tree, something in the flower.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know.
Hmm.
I was hoping you could tell me.
No, I'll have to research that. I did an experiment years ago. I don't know if you, florists used to, for a dozen roses, they would put each rose in a tube that they would fill with a solution. And I used those, literally inverted them on something like a clothesline. I would fill it with a solution and invert it, and then bees would come and feed from that. They could insert their mouth part in the tube. And I watched a number of bumblebees in particular come up, stick their long tongues in there, slurp it up. And unlike a flower where, you can only take up so much and then you have to move on to the next flower, here was this massive food reserve. They fell to the ground, they got so heavy. So there is that too, that if you had a huge food reserve for something in one particular location, they might feed to excess.
Okay.
Other questions? And maybe I can, since Bryce is here and he's our next speaker, maybe I can put Bryce on the spot to say a word or two about what he's going to talk about 2 weeks from tonight.
Oh, but then I should know, shouldn't I? No, yeah. Well, some of you, the title of my talk is Ravens and Writing Desks. So if you haven't read Alice in Wonderland recently, maybe that's one way you can find out what that's all about. But that's just a lead-in, because I'll be talking about a lot of stuff about science and people's lack of understanding of science and things like that. It'll be pretty eclectic, just like me.
Great. All right. Well, unless there are any other questions, I think maybe we can call it a night. Thank you so much, Brenda. That was great. And we are here the second and fourth Thursday of the month through the end of May. And join us every time.
Thank you, Brenda. That was super interesting.
Great. Take care of the bees, everybody.
Yes, fascinating how complex the engineering and the social lives, everything.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, all. I'm going to click the end button.